We are talking about steak, not just steak, but foolproof steak. How do you cook it perfectly every time? So we're gonna go over making a compound butter that is amazing for steak, chicken, and pork. We are going to go over how to perfectly cook a thick steak. Third, you're going to learn how, and more importantly, when to prep your steaks, depending on how much time you have and the outcome you are looking for. So without further ado, there are two things you should do right away. The first, start preheating your oven to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. The second is we are using some butter a little bit later on. I want you to have at least 2 tablespoons out on the counter coming up to room temperature. That's just going to make your life a little bit easier later on when we make that compound butter. So let's get started. We're going to start prepping our steak. Okay, I just picked this up this afternoon. This is a beautiful New York skirt steak. It's a little over half a pound. You want something probably like this is good for 1 to 2 servings if you are serving it with, say, a side salad or something along those lines. And so you're aiming for something around 6 to 8 ounces. This is just over 8 ounces. Right here is already where a lot of folks make a mistake. What they end up doing is they just start seasoning this right away. But if you can look really closely, I'll bring it up for you. Can you see that shine on the steak? What that tells us is there's actually a lot of moisture content on the surface. And we want to get rid of that moisture. Otherwise, we won't get a very good crust on our steak. What we end up getting is a steaming on the outside. And that steaming keeps our steak from cooking as quickly as we want to get that really great crust. So the goal here is actually a super dry outer portion of our steak. So we just pat it dry. We try to get as much of that moisture as we can all the way around. So we just get a super dry steak. Now the recipe for tonight, super easy. We've got our steak, 6 to 8 ounces, maybe 8, aim for 8 on the low end, actually, about half a pound. We are going to use salt and pepper. Salt, pepper. We want 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter. Already got that out here. And then we want about 1 tablespoon of blue cheese. And we're going to use about a teaspoon, maybe a little bit more, depending on what we're feeling, of fresh chives. We're just going to chop those up. So not much in way of ingredients, but this is going to be a really phenomenal steak. So again, we just want this really, really, really dry. We are going to prep it the same way if we had a lot of time or if we had a little bit of time. What we're going to do is we're going to rub a good amount of salt on the outside of this. We're also going to put a good amount of black pepper on it. The salt is much more important though, in terms of a chemical reaction standpoint. And so we rub a good amount of salt around the outside of the steak. And if we only have a few minutes before we have to start cooking this, say 10 minutes or less, we would season this and cook it right away. If we had, say, 45 minutes to an hour before we have to cook the steaks, we would season this, set it aside at room temperature, leave it out, and let it sit with that salt covering it. The salt will initially take some of the moisture out of the steak, and you'll see it on the surface, and then the meat will start pulling it back in, so the surface will actually get fairly dry again if you leave it out for at least 45 minutes at room temperature. Now you notice there's a gap in the timing there. I went from 10 minutes to 45. That gap between 10 and 45 is the danger zone. If you have anything in between there, you need to either cook it fast or wait longer, because that window of 10 to 45 minutes is when you will lose the most moisture in your steak. So if you season it with salt and you wait, say, 20 to 30 minutes, a lot of the moisture is pulled up to the surface and hasn't yet had a chance to loosen up the meat and get pulled back in. So when you throw it on your pan, there'll be a lot of moisture sitting on top. You get a lot of steaming rather than a beautiful crust being built up, and that will, it won't give you the texture that you want, and it'll dry out your steak more than if you just waited more time or give it less time with the salt on there. Now, if you have significantly more than 45 minutes, say 1 to 3 days, what you'll end up doing is you'll season it the same way we do here, and then you would pull out I can show you. Pull out a cooling rack like you might use in baking. And you set your steak, here we go. You would set your steak on top of the cooling rack, put that on top of either a baking rack or a plate in the fridge, and just place it in the fridge for 1 to 3 days uncovered. It's sort of like a mini dry aging, and you could test it out. Buy a couple steaks, buy 3 to 4 steaks. It's gonna be a really great week. buy 3 to 4 steaks. If you get 4, here's how you break it down to really treat yourself and see how you prefer it. Day 1 steak, you prep it within 10 minutes, start cooking it. Day 2 steak, you prep it same time as the first steak, actually prep all 4 of them at the same time, right? The second steak, you put in the fridge on a wire rack, uncovered, so wire rack on top of a baking rack or on top of a plate, so that there's airflow that can come in underneath the steak as well. And you let that sit there for a day. Then you cook that steak the same way we're going to cook this other steak tonight. Steak number 3, you give it 2 days in the fridge. Do the same thing, cook it how we're going to cook it tonight. Steak number 4, you wait 3 whole days. On the 3rd day, cook that steak. You're going to be blown away by the flavor differences you get from a steak that was allowed to season for 10 minutes and one that was allowed to season for 3 days. It's phenomenal. We are going to use a generous amount of salt here. Just rub it into our surface. And you might be afraid, like there's a lot of salt on here. You might be afraid you're adding too much. Don't be, because in the worst case scenario, you can rub some of the salt off right before we throw it in the skillet. Most people will not put enough salt on most of their food, especially big cuts of meat like this. And just bear in mind, this isn't the world's thickest steak. It's a thick-ish steak, but we're only seasoning the outside. We're not adding any seasoning to the inside of the steak. So you can have a little bit more on the outside than you might typically expect because the inside isn't being seasoned. I'm gonna flip that over. So that's about right. Okay, throw some black pepper on here. You can be pretty generous with this because there's no seasoning on the inside of the steak. We're just hitting the outside of this. Now, if I had more time, I'd let this sit for at least 45 minutes at room temp, probably closer to an hour. But we're moving pretty quick tonight, and I'm going to show you how to do this in 10 minutes or less. So that's all seasoned up. That's beautiful. What we're going to do is use the heaviest bottom skillet you've got. So for me, this is an enameled cast iron skillet that I like to use. Heaviest bottom skillet you've got that can go into the oven. So if it's got a wooden handle, it's got a plastic handle, you don't want to use that. You want stainless steel, you want cast iron, you want enameled cast iron, you want carbon steel. There's a lot of options. Just nothing with a wooden handle. I mean, technically a wooden handle would work. It would darken over time. It's not ideal. Definitely nothing with a plastic handle. Some pans these days have silicone handles. The silicone can handle the heat we're throwing at it. We're only going to have the oven at 275, so it's not crazy. I just wouldn't make a habit of it. It's not necessarily ideal. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our heavy bottomed pan, because we don't want, or rather, let me take that a step back. Heavy bottom pan, get it screaming hot, crazy hot. Throw our steak in there. The reason we want a heavy bottom pan is because when the steak hits, we want that pan to have enough residual heat left when a cold piece of steak hits it that it can come back up to temp pretty quickly. If we have a really light, flimsy pan, the kind of stuff you typically find at like a Walmart or something, the pan's going to lose so much heat. When the steak hits it, it's going to take a long time to come back up to temp. And then you don't get that beautiful crust on your steak. Again, you get kind of like a steaming going on. You get more of a gray steak rather than a beautiful crusty brown steak. So heaviest pan you've got. Use that screaming hot, which means we also want to be selective with the cooking medium that we use, meaning the oil or the butter or the fat. So normally if I was cooking at a low temp, I might use like an olive oil. If I'm cooking, or a butter, which I love to cook with. If I'm cooking a really high temp though, I want to use an oil that can handle high temperatures really well. You've got a couple options for this. You can use clarified butter or ghee, which is butter that has had a lot of the moisture and more importantly the proteins removed. That handles high temperatures really well. It also has a lot of flavor. So ghee and clarified butter, wonderful. The other option you've got, and this is what I'm going with tonight, is something like an avocado oil. Avocado oil is fairly tasteless and it handles high heat really well. So we can throw it in there and we won't smoke out our kitchen. What we're going to do is get that pan really screaming hot with just a little bit of avocado oil in there to help transmit more heat from the pan to the steak. Because I've shown this in the past, but I can give you a quick little recap. We like to think that the bottoms of our pans are totally flat and smooth. It's not actually how they work or what they look like. They're actually really crackly. It's a bunch of little bumps and divots. It's kind of like the surface of the moon. There's all these craters all over the place. And if we just throw something on there directly, sitting on top, there's all these little crackly bits. They don't actually make much surface contact. So imagine this is the pan, right? It's not actually smooth. It's got peaks and troughs, and when you throw a steak on top, it only hits those little peaks. That's not that much surface area actually getting contact. When we throw oil in there, the oil or the butter or the ghee fills in these little divots and it smooths out over the top. And when we put our steak down, all the heat's going to transmit across the whole surface, so we get much more even cooking. That's why we so frequently add oil or butter or ghee or some sort of medium to our pan. It makes the cooking more even. It's often also just a great way to add extra flavor. So we're going to get our pan screaming hot, throw the steak in there. We're only going to leave it there long enough to get a good crust on there. Then when that happens, we're going to immediately flip it over, throw that pan with the residual heat still into our oven at 275. We're going to have a temperature probe in there, testing for temperature, and I'll talk about temperatures a little bit when we throw it in. And then we just wait for it to get to just about the perfect temperature. While that's happening, we're going to make our compound butter, and then steak's gonna come out. We're going to let it rest for a little bit, and then you get to enjoy your beautiful steaks. So let's get going. We want this screaming hot. I'm gonna wait for this to heat up quite a bit. While that's going on, I'm gonna throw in just a little bit of avocado oil. I don't need much. Again, that's just to help transmit that heat more evenly throughout the pan. Our oil, because we're just going so hot, is heating up pretty quick. Now, another thing to keep in mind, you might be cooking more than one steak here tonight, or when you're watching this video. If you were cooking more than one steak, you would want a bigger pan than this. When you're cooking multiple things in a pan, especially something like steaks, you want a minimum of 1 inch clearance on all sides for each steak. So if you can't get that with this pan, you need a bigger pan or you need 2 pans. This is ready because there's a shimmer. It's just like a slight wave when you look at the oil. You can see it on top. Perfect. And again, this is only going to be sitting here long enough for us to get a good crust. You can already see there's some heat climbing up on the sides here. And you can tell when your steak is ready to flip, because right now if I try to slide this, it's sticking to the pan. It's not sliding easily. It's not moving, right? You can see me pushing the whole pan sliding. That's how I actually know the steak isn't ready to flip. When there's a good crust, the meat will release itself from the pan very easily. So we're just going to give that a minute. You can already see this is starting to release fairly easily. There's a little resistance on this side, so we'll give it just a tiny bit longer. This is a fast process though. You'll see we haven't been sitting here very long. And we don't want to be, because we want the most effective part of our baking to happen in the oven rather than on the stovetop. Now if this is a really thin steak, you would, there we go. So that released a little bit. Some of the salt came off, and that's totally fine. Let's see how that looks. So we almost have a good crust on this. You can probably see right there. We've got some good crusting going on the edges here. I'm just gonna give this another minute or so before we go any further. Okay, so this is probably about right at this point. I'm going to flip this, throw a temperature probe in here, and then we're going to immediately throw this in the oven. I've got my temperature probe. We'll set it to a temp in a sec. While it's in the oven, we'll have a few minutes to discuss ideal temperatures for cooking your meats. There we go. We want to kind of set this in at a bit of an angle so that we get to the deepest part of the steak. Oh, too far. That's about right. Cool. So the internal temp of the steak is still only in the mid-70s right now. Transfer this to the oven. So just be good to yourself, and don't burn your hands. Use a good towel. When we're talking about steaks, the main things we talk about are rare, medium, medium well, and well. Rare is about 120 degrees, and that's on the low end. You don't want to really go lower than that. 120 degrees is a pretty good place for killing off a good amount of bacteria in steaks. Now, a lot of folks say they really like rare, but if you give them a blind taste test, most folks actually come back and say that they like medium rare, and that's between about 125 to 130, a little closer to that 130 range. Next up, we've got, I wrote it down just to make sure I didn't tell you anything wrong. After that medium rare, we've got medium, that's about 140 degrees. Medium well is 150, and then well is 160. At well, you've cooked out a ton of the moisture. You are absolutely going to have a very dry steak. If you order, a fun fact, if you order a well done steak at most restaurants, what they're actually going to do is take a steak that someone sent back because they said it was overcooked, and they will trim off a piece so you don't really notice, and then cook the hell out of it and give it back to you. So you're often just getting steak that someone else already said they didn't want and was pre-cooked a while ago, and they just threw it in the back of a fridge. So don't order well done at restaurants. You'll get the worst steak they have. They won't give you a good cut. But most people, if you give them a blind taste test, will prefer a medium rare steak, which is going to be 125, 130 degrees internal. So internal temperature. So what that means is we put that temperature probe into our steak. I'm going to set, or rather I already did, because I always set this temp on my steaks. I set an alarm that's going to go off when the internal temperature of my steak hits 125. Now the ideal medium rare is about 130, but meat, after we take it off the heat, actually still rises in temperature a little bit. The bigger the piece of meat, the more it's going to rise. If we have a great big roast, the internal temperature could rise 10, maybe even 15 degrees over time as we let it rest after it comes out of the oven. A smaller steak, one like this, maybe 3 degrees, maybe 5. A thicker steak, probably more like 5. So I like to wait until about 125 degrees. And then I know I can eyeball it. I know it's going to be in the pan for another moment or two as I take it out of the oven. And that is going to give me about the right amount of time for the internal temp to hit 130. Take it out of the pan and then tent it for a few minutes. And the reason we tent it is twofold. And we tent it, it's the same thing as letting it rest. Two things happen. The tenting helps trap some of that heat so the internal temperature rises a little bit more. That's why I feel fairly comfortable taking out at 125. So we get to 130. And the other thing that happens with that is there's two ways to kill off bacteria. One is high heat instantly. The other is lower heat over an extended period of time. Most of the internal temp guidelines that we get for things that are well done or fully cooked, it's with the idea of high heat instantly. So say a chicken breast. Often we're told to cook our chicken breasts to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, because when it's at 160 Fahrenheit, all the bacteria that we worry about in chicken is dead like that. Well, the problem with a chicken breast that's cooked to 160 degrees Fahrenheit is it's bone dry and is terrible. You can actually get the same amount of bacteria killing, the same effectiveness of that 160 like that if you get it up to 145, tent it and let it rest for 5 minutes. Because 5 minutes at 145 will kill the same amount of bacteria as 5 seconds at 160. So you get the same outcome of safety. And a similar thing happens with basically every cut of meat, and that's what we're going to do with our steak. So that's the first thing. We get that internal temp over an extended period of time, and that gives us the safety that we're looking for. A second is moisture content. And I will allude to this a lot when we talk about cooking meat. Moisture content is really key, and we want to cook things in such a way where we get to retain as much of that moisture as possible. When we overcook the meat, we squeeze out all the juices and it's just gone. We get something really dry. The other way we tend to dry out our meat is we cook it, and then when we're done, we immediately cut into it. And when we do that, we allow a lot of the juices to just flow out and they're gone. What we do to avoid that is we let it rest for a few minutes, and here's why that works. A steak, I'm looking to see if I have any good visuals here. Imagine I'm packing up my kitchen, so a lot of the stuff is away right now. Imagine this is a steak, right? I'm sure you've seen it as steaks have cooked before. Sometimes they buckle a little bit. This happens with burgers a lot. They tend to buckle a little bit, and the centers kind of get bigger, and the edges come in, the sides come in a little bit. And what's happening is that excess heat on the outside of the steak, the bottom, the top, the sides, it's actually tightening up those protein strands. Those protein strands are squeezing, kind of like a bunch of straws lined up to each other with their ends sealed. They squeeze and they push all of their moisture to the center of that steak. And that's one of the reasons you'll see it kind of bunch up like this. There's a high pressure water system in the middle of your steak. If when you're done cooking your steak, you take it out of the oven, or you take it off your skillet or off the grill, and you immediately slice into it, that high pressure from the outer edges and outer sides of your steak will still be there. And it's going to force all those juices out. It's going to end up on your plate, and it's just going to be gone. It doesn't get pulled back in. If, however, you allow your meat to rest, most of the time, the cut of meat you're going to be cooking, a steak for 1 or 2 people, a chicken breast, a chicken thigh, you only really need to let your meat rest for about 5 minutes. Much bigger pieces of meat, like a big piece like turkeys, those might have to rest 45 minutes, maybe even a couple hours. And what you want to see is with a temperature probe on the inside, so you know exactly what's going on, you want to see about a 5-degree temperature drop after you've hit your peak temp. So in my steak, I'm aiming for 125, which it has already hit. So I need to take this out of the oven now. I'm going to take a little plate out. I'm just going to throw the steak on there real quick, and I'm going to cover it with a little bit of foil just to let it rest for a few minutes. When you are at home cooking this, just keep an eye on the internal temp. So back to what I was saying about making sure your steak holds on to its moisture. If you let it sit for a few minutes, if you let those proteins relax so that it's no longer sitting like this, but it kind of loosens up a bit, the moisture content on the inside can spread back out again. One way to do that is a small cut of meat. You can just kind of assume 5-ish minutes. If it's something really big though, and you're aiming for a certain temperature, say it's a turkey or chicken, and you want an internal temperature of, say 145 on your chicken, right in your chicken breast. You hit 145, you let it rest for a while. You can leave your temperature probe in the chicken breast and then wait for the chicken to get to about 140. When it's at 140, you know the meat has had plenty of time to relax and rest a bit. Those proteins have opened back up. The moisture is redistributed throughout the rest of the protein there. So you won't have that high pressure system that when you cut into it, all the moisture leaks out. So while our steak is resting, so that we get to hit the internal temperatures that make sure it's really safe, and we get our moisture to redistribute and not get just shoved out as soon as we cut into it, we're going to make our compound butter. And tonight's compound butter is really simple. It's butter, blue cheese, fresh chives. So we've got our butter. The butter has been sitting out so that we get it up to room temperature. The blue cheese is really potent with flavor, but it's great with steaks. You want to make your life a little bit easier, so you'll notice when I picked up these chives, I folded them in half. I can do that again and basically accomplish the same thing. So make it small enough that you can handle it. So we're going to go like this and then just chop these up. Sprinkle that into your butter. It's at 5 minutes, and it's totally fine for your meat to rest a little longer. You'd be surprised how well things like your proteins hold on to heat and how long it takes for them to get cold. So, super simple. Butter, 2 tablespoons. Blue cheese, 1 tablespoon. Chives, just eyeball it. Pick whatever looks good to you. But if you want to scale this up really big, you would do, say, 1/4 of a tablespoon to that ratio. So 2, 1, 1/4. There we go. That's our blue cheese chive compound butter that we're going to throw onto our steak. Throw a little bit on top of the steak. There's enough residual heat on the steak still. That's just going to melt a little bit, and you can spread it around. In just a moment, you can cook an absolutely delicious steak in a very short period of time.